Why are there so many translations of the Bible and which one should I use? Right off the bat, I just want to clarify that just because there are over 450 English translations of the Bible does not mean that there are over 450 different Bibles. That is a misunderstanding of translation theory. So one reason we have so many translations is simply because English is an evolving language and we need updated translations. Another reason you have different English translations is because each translation kind of has its own goal. And this is where translation theory comes in. There's kind of three camps you can sit in with biblical translation. One is word for word, another is thought for thought, and then the last one is paraphrasing. Word for word translations. These are going to be your NASB, ESV, RSV, and the goal of these translations is to be a very literal word for word translation from the original language into English. Now that sounds great. Why wouldn't you want a word for word translation? Well, sometimes because the original language like Greek or Hebrew might structure their sentences differently, then when you try to translate that over into English, it kind of makes for a choppy and not so smooth read. Also, sometimes a word in Greek or Hebrew doesn't have an English equivalent word, and this might make it harder to understand. And then you have thought for thought. These are going to be translations like the NLT, the NIV, or the CEB, and the goal of these translations is going to be more concerned with portraying the meaning of the text rather than being super accurate to the literal wording of the original text. So that's going to make these translations a little bit more readable. They're going to flow nicer. They're going to use words that are very familiar to you. But the downside to these translations is that the reader is going to be more heavily relying on the translator's interpretation of the meaning of the text. Because what they're doing is they're reading the original Greek or Hebrew, and then they're determining what they think it means and then putting that into modern English. And honestly, this isn't like a huge deal. The group of translators that are translating these texts are usually doing a very honest job of translating the text, but there might be a few passages here and there where a theological bias of a group of translators might affect how they translate a certain passage. And then finally, you have the paraphrase translations. These are going to be translations like the Message or the Passion. These translations are going to be paraphrasing the biblical texts. They're not super concerned with accuracy to the original text, and they're often done by a single translator, whereas the word for word and the thought for thought, these are done by groups of translators. So I would never advise using a translation like the Message or the Passion translation, but there are some translations that I would advise. So for quiet times and personal devotion, I would recommend the NIV or the thought for thought translations. This is simply because of the readability aspect of it. And then if you are going to be doing an academic study, a word study, 100% would recommend a more word for word translation. The reason for this is that if you're going to be like academically studying something, you want to get as close to the original language as possible, and that would be your word for word